Most of us were raised to think followers should be loyal, obedient, deferential.
I know sometimes economic responsibilities or healthcare plans keep us working in places that aren't the healthiest for us, but there are ways that hopefully we can make them healthier. Leaders are supposed to help develop their followers. Followers can help develop their leaders and make them into better leaders.
What if I told you that the biggest leadership challenges aren't caused by weak or excessively powerful leaders, but perhaps sometimes by followers who stay silent when they should speak up? If you've ever wondered whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to challenge your leader or protect your job, this episode is for you. Today, you will discover why followership isn't about compliance, it's about courage. You will learn the 5 circles of followers that surround every leader, 5 behaviors that separate courageous followers from silent enablers, and when intelligent disobedience becomes a duty. Whether you're leading a team, serving in government, or navigating complex hierarchies, which I think may cover nearly all of us, this conversation will shift how you think about your power and responsibility. And hopefully it will feel empowering. Hi, it's Dr. Mira Brancu, and welcome back to The Hard Skills. Today, I'm excited to welcome Ira Chaleff. Ira Chaleff is an author, speaker, and executive coach in the greater Washington, D.C. area. He has advised members of Congress, including directing the Nonpartisan Congressional Management Foundation, where he is now chair emeritus. He's also instructed and directed the U.S. Naval Academy around these things, the State Department, and governments worldwide. He studied what stops tyrants and what creates them. His classic book, The Courageous Follower, and his award-winning book, Intelligent Disobedience, were translated into multiple languages, including Russian and Chinese. His newest book, To Stop a Tyrant, The Power of Political Followers, has won several awards and received high praise from both sides of the political spectrum. As a practitioner, rather than an academic, his work is a resource for individuals who want their voices heard, regardless of their position in a hierarchy or political regime. And frankly, I think his books need to be required reading for all folks going into politics and all leadership development training. Yes, I said that. That is a strong statement, and I completely believe it. So welcome, Ira Chaleff, to the show.
Thank you, Mira. What a terrific introduction.
Yeah. Really excited to have you here. I've dug into and read Courageous Follower. I've started and I'm about halfway through To Stop a Tyrant, loving both of them already. I've seen, multiple of your resources, the presentations that you've done. So let's start with just the concept of courageous follower. Most of us were raised to think followers should be loyal, obedient, deferential. So I'm curious, what is a courageous follower then? And how are you kind of asking us to reconceptualize or rethink followership?
It's a great place to start because there's a conceptual threshold that you have to cross in order to understand what are we really talking about. Those of us in the U.S. have been brought up to believe that everyone is supposed to be a leader. Now, I don't argue with that. I think that all of us at times can be a leader. But imagine if everyone on a football team, a basketball team, a soccer team, all tried to lead at the same time. You'd have chaos. So the only way leadership works is if you have committed and engaged and talented followers. Now, people don't like to be called a follower, do they?
True.
I think the reason for that is because we've misidentified follower as a personality type. It's really not that. What it is, it's a role. Sometimes we play the lead role, sometimes we play the follower role. And as long as we understand which role we're playing, and we play that role with strength, with integrity, with grace, then we have a beautiful dance between leaders and followers. Imagine if both partners in a dance tried to lead. Again, you would not have a very beautiful dance. So, but that doesn't mean you can't switch off. Sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow. So that's the first thing I need people to understand.
Hmm.
We're talking about a role you play at times in relationship to a leader.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the large majority of people who are in formal roles of leadership also are in positions of following other leaders and supporting each other. And if we all sort of like work well, like that sort of dance example, right? We are complementing and moving together and aligned, ideally, instead of just stepping on each other's toes or all over each other or
Literally or
cutting each other at
figuratively.
the knees, right? So, in your Courageous Follower book, you shared your own experience of transforming from a leader who yelled and threatened to someone who were trying to develop better models of success. And I'm curious, how do we fall trap into that kind of experience? And I'd love to just hear your own story about what happened. How did you get to the point where you realized this is not going to be productive? This is not a way to lead. This is not a way to follow. And you ended up sort of like switching it up and getting into this courageous followership idea.
Well,
Tell
I'll
us about
tell
your
you the
journey.
story that I tell myself. In other words, do
Okay,
we ever
I'll take
really
it.
fully see ourselves as others see us? I had to do a lot of soul searching here because I was not proud at all of the way I led, even though I was at times quite effective. But I think it was very, very hard on the people around me, and ultimately, that's just not okay. I grew up in a faith community where there was a youth congregation that was led by an adult who had a severe temper, real anger management issues. And yet, for years, he led this congregation. So, in that sense, somewhere in my brain, maybe my reptilian brain, I go, oh, look, he's pretty successful. Maybe that's the way you're supposed to lead. Um, Bad lesson. Unfortunately, later on in my early adulthood, I worked with another leader who had very similar temperament and again was, by some metrics, quite successful and again very hard on people. But this sort of gave me whatever there was in me. And I think there's all kinds of personalities within ourselves. Which ones get ascendant and which ones appropriately get contained is part of growing up and maturing. But I think, again, given this really toxic environment, but one in which we were very engaged and we got things done, I learned the wrong lesson, or my nervous system learned the wrong lesson. And one of the things I found, and this is what people who have not experienced this don't viscerally understand. I would shock myself as much as anyone
Hmm.
else when I had an
Hmm.
outburst because it didn't seem under my control. I think it wasn't under my control anymore. That doesn't excuse it, but it had taken over, and that's terrible. How did I change? Well, I think that the first way behaviorally that I changed was when I went to another environment and the director of that organization had someone like with a temper before, and he learned that you can't tolerate that. So as soon as this emerged a little bit for me, he called me aside. He said, Ira, we cannot talk to each other like that here. It's just not acceptable. That was the constraint that I needed to be able to then start managing myself. Yes, I did further therapy. I worked on my own anger management. So it's a process, but it was somebody defining what are the boundaries for acceptable behavior within an organization that allowed me to step away from the bad role models that I had and start learning from a very good role model.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm hearing a couple of things had to be present. One was somebody being honest with you about what was not working. Another was the environment itself and what it would and would not tolerate. And then the other is you receiving feedback and being willing to take it in.
Yes. Well, it was in my self-interest to take it in because I realized if I wanted to keep doing the work with this organization, and I really did, I really liked its work, I would need to change. And that's often a factor in self-transformation is when one realizes that our own self-interest is at stake. That perhaps helps us override whatever automaticities have sort of become part of our operation. I'm not saying this would be true for everyone. I'm only reporting on what the journey that I went through.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think from reading your books, I think that is partly the reality is that there's got to be some self interest or motivation for why you choose to continue in one direction or change in another direction. And if you are allowed to continue and it, on your path and it's working, quote unquote, working for you, whatever that success means, then you'll continue that way until you hit a barrier and then you have to make a different decision. So there was, some barriers that were put in your way. And this happens for many leaders, right? That some barriers get in the way and you have to sort of like think about what do I do with these barriers?
Yes,
And
and
yeah.
what I then observed in others, as you said, I've done a lot of work with congressional offices in the U.S. Many members are even tempered, but there's a significant minority that are not, and they don't sort of fall under the same human resources constraints that you may find in an organization. If they become very temper driven, there's nobody to tell them, no, that's not okay. Now, I've seen on several occasions a staff member who works for them at their pleasure have a private conversation with them and say, I really believe in you. I want to help you. But if you ever talk to me that way again, you will have my resignation. And that would change that congressperson's behavior towards that staff member, not change their behavior to the whole office. But
Mhm.
but why did that happen? Well, it was because that staff member had already established himself as very valuable to the member, and therefore it was in their self-interest to do to take this really seriously. And even though the staff member didn't have formal power, they had the power to say, well, I'm not going to keep working here if this behavior continues. And so, that's one of the lessons when I'm coaching an individual who's working with this type of manager. That's one of the stories that I tell, and then I work with them to see how can they do something similar in their relationship with a leader who they feel is doing well for the organization, but is too bruising for them. And, life is short. And I know sometimes economic responsibilities or healthcare plans keep us working in places that aren't the healthiest for us, but there are ways that hopefully we can make them healthier. And that's one of the things I take up in The Courageous Follower.
Yeah, let's keep talking about what can make it easier, what facilitates the process. You've mentioned a couple already. One is like having a good, trusting relationship, being highly valued. I think maybe even recognizing your own influence on the leader that you're, talking with. What else have you found can be helpful in facilitating these kinds of conversations?
Yeah. So this sometimes sounds like a radical idea, but just as leaders are supposed to help develop their followers, followers can help develop their leaders and make them into better leaders. But it starts with the understanding that the leader's not perfect, just as you're not perfect. And if you expect perfection of them, that's actually a bit of a childlike stance. Oh, I want mommy and daddy to be perfect. They're not perfect either. And as mature adults, we need to recognize we're imperfect human beings working together for a purpose. And how do we help each other be better human beings in service to that purpose? So there's a frame with which you start. The next thing is to understand that power comes from different sources. Of course, there's positional power. Your boss potentially could fire you. You can't usually fire your boss. So there's that kind of power differential. But that doesn't mean you don't have any power. There are many different sources of power. You may have the power of your competence, your speciality, your network, your history, your dedication to the organization's mission. So that's one thing you need to consciously look at. What is my power? You don't want to inflate your power, but you don't want to diminish it either. You don't want to dismiss the power you have. Then, when you have a realistic assessment, we hope, of the power that you do bring to the relationship, then we go into the subject of courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what you do in the face of fear. If you had no fear, you'd need no courage. So, yes, there will be risk in having a difficult conversation with a problematic leader. But there are ways to have more productive conversations and less productive conversations. I take a lot of time in The Courageous Follower to give examples and even scripts for how you might have a productive conversation. No guarantees that it'll get you where you want to go, but often it does. And this is what surprises people.
Yeah, I do appreciate that. Like, I think one of the messages that you included in your book, I don't know that it was explicit, maybe it was, but patience and persistence. That it's like not a one and done. And then, like, if it doesn't work out, all of a sudden you just give up. Right. And I just remember like one story that I had where I was kind of newer to a situation and I was giving my leader some feedback and he did not take it well. And I just, reflected and I thought, you know what? I actually didn't have the trusting relationship that I normally do to give that kind of feedback. So I'm going to wait. I'm going to see what happens. 18 months later, I give exactly the same feedback. He receives it incredibly well. And it's because I had worked hard to develop a more trusting relationship that I have his back and I care, right? And that I'm not just saying it because I'm obstinate or, poking away at him and that kind of thing, which can be really hard for a lot of leaders because, I've been in that situation where I've been the leader being poked at and it's really, really hard to constantly be scrutinized. And so there's also an element of just empathizing with how hard it is to lead sometimes.
That's beautiful. 18 months is a long time. More power to you for hanging in there. Um,
It was
but
important to me.
yeah, but that's exactly right. In my model, you know, models help us to understand who we are, how we're behaving, and how others are behaving. They're not perfect, but they're useful. In in my model of followership styles, I place a lot of emphasis on the correct balance between the courage to be supportive of the leader and the courage to question or challenge them with feedback if needed. Now, what does that look like? Probably 80, 90% of the time you're being supportive, but that crucial, 10% of the time or whatever it is, when you need to give them feedback, you do it and you've earned the right to do it because they get how supportive you are. And even if, all of us have a little trouble with feedback, so they may initially kind of be defensive and even blow you off. But I found, don't be surprised if they start changing um, after that conversation, because once they let it in and they're not being defensive in the moment, they again value the relationship and want to see what they can do. Now, what you need to do then 'Cause you need to catch them when they're doing it right. And you need to reinforce it, say, ma'am, sir, whatever you call them, Jo Joe, Joan, whatever. I just want to say, I noticed in this meeting that when I did this and, in the past, you might have done such and such. Instead, you did such and such. I really appreciated it. Thank you so much. That's reinforcing. And again, that's so powerful.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you made a really important point about, just like we would want to receive support more times than not, recognizing that you're going to end up not being heard as often if all you're doing is criticizing and you're not offering enough of the, I also support you.
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's one of the styles of followership. I call it the individualistic style, where, and everybody knows somebody like this, where every time you're sitting in a meeting, they're often very smart people, but they tend to only speak in the meeting in disagreement with what the leader or the group are saying. And that becomes so predictable that other people kind of roll their eyes and goes, there he goes again. And that becomes very frustrating for him because he is kind of sidelining himself. And when I coach someone like that, I said, pay attention for when there's something that you hear that you can agree with. Don't stay silent then. Open your mouth and say, yeah, I can get behind that because of this and this and that. And the first time you do, people might fall off their chair because they're not used to you, you know, being so positive. But this can't be inauthentic. It has to be authentic. But again, it's putting a little money into the social bank so that when you withdraw some money, you don't wind up with a negative balance.
Yes, yes. So you mentioned that's one of the styles of followership. What are the other styles?
Yeah, well, in my model, I only have four. It's one of these four quadrant models, but none of them are there to shame the person. That's very, very important. And basically, the two vectors are the amount of support you're giving and the amount of or willingness to question or give feedback. And in the lower model, where both courage to support or ability to support and ability to or willingness to speak up are low, I call this the resource. People can be in this model for a variety of reasons. It could be that they're struggling with health issues, with childcare issues. They're very new on the job. They're doing a graduate degree program while they're trying to hold down a job. And they can't do more than they're doing. As long as they do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, that may be the style they need to be in. And it isn't a style that's going to be one that progresses their career, but it might be the style that works for them at that time. When the courage or the tendency to speak positively, to give support is low, but to criticize is high, we've already talked about. That's the individualist style. And again, simply paying attention to giving more visible, authentic support will change that dynamic. The two styles that most people are in are the implementer and the partner. What's the difference? The implementer is very high on support, but not so high on the willingness to speak up. Implementers keep the world running. And leaders love implementers. They can always be counted on. So it's a very good style in terms of your own career. But the problem is if a leader only surrounds herself with implementers, one day when she's about to make a serious mistake, no one speaks up clearly enough to help her prevent that mistake. So it's not in the leader's self interest to only have implement. The remaining style is the partner, where there's a healthy balance between support and the willingness to speak up. And it doesn't mean that the leader necessarily accepts you as a partner, but that you operate as if you're a partner. You assume full responsibility for the outcomes of the organization, and you're willing to do whatever is necessary to try to make things work as optimally as possible. And if you do that well and skillfully, and again, in the book, there's lots of ways to help do it that are more acceptable, many leaders than not, you will eventually be looked at as a partner, very, very cherished partner.
Yeah, it reminds me of this quote from the book. Followers and leaders both orbit around the purpose. Followers do not orbit around the leader. Say more about
Yeah.
that.
Very central, very, very central. And common purpose is the glue that keeps us together in whatever the mission is of our unit, of our team, of our organization. And then the framework within which we hold that is what are our shared values, which determine how we pursue this mission and how we won't because they violate our values. Those are the core elements of healthy teams.
Yeah, yeah. Why do we sometimes find it hard to focus on the mission and that purpose as opposed to on the leader, the person in charge?
So here's an interesting construct that one of my colleagues in this field of leading and following uses a lot. Leadership can be considered a system that consists of three parts: the leader, the followers, and the context. There's always context. The context of a military team is different than the context of a hospital team or a elementary school team. The context of when budgets are ample and when they're scarce is different. The context of when a country is at peace or at war is hugely different. So we always have to be cognizant of what's the current context, because that may be making it very hard for the team, for the leader, for the organization to stay as focused on the purpose as it was designed to do. And we use our capacities, our skills, our genius, if you will, to help keep us as much as possible on our purpose while staying appropriately flexible given shifts in the context, in the economy, in the culture, in the disasters that may be happening ecologically around us, affecting us. All of those factors that are always present in some mixture when we're pursuing a mission.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You started describing different kinds of followers, and I know in To Stop a Tyrant, you were also talking about like different circles of followers. I'd love for you to describe for us a little bit more about those circles and so that people can start like thinking about the context in which you may or may not have ability to be a courageous follower or how to be in that context in that circle.
Yeah, Mira, we're at great risk here, bringing in too many models in one conversation. But with apologies to your listenership, we'll try to not create confusion here. So, in To Stop a Tyrant, I am mainly looking at the relationship of leading and following in a political context. Up till now, we've been talking about an organizational context. Yes, the styles of followership still hold in a political context, but there are other, again, contextual factors. In politics, your access to the leader really determines how much power you have to make a difference in what they're doing. So, working from the furthest outside circle to the innermost, I have used five classifications. The outermost is us citizens or even non citizens, but the general population that the government is supposed to serve. The next inner circle are those of us who choose to be activists, either in support of or against something the government is doing, against policy, a program, for a candidate, against a candidate. The third circle are bureaucrats. Even though bureaucracy gets a bad name in our cultural context, in fact, no government can operate without a bureaucracy. And bureaucracies have virtues and they have vices. And if you find yourself in the bureaucracy, and millions of Americans are in the bureaucracy, either at federal or state or city level, then you have certain other ways of interacting with the leader. And in each of these circles, I go into the different channels, the different powers you have, the different challenges that you have. The next fourth circle, which is the next to the, actually, I'm numbering them backwards, but the circle that's the next to the innermost circle I call the elite circle. And these are people who not just have a lot of money and campaign contributions, but these are people who have big audiences, big, podcasts that hundreds of thousands of people listen to. They can be celebrities that, have millions of people on their social media. It can be very high profile judges or lawmakers. It can be pastors who have a national following. And all of these have more interest to the governing leader because they know if they stay in their favor, they'll help bring their own constituencies to support the leader. And if they get turned off by the leader, then they will tend to influence their constituencies in other directions. So they have a certain amount of power. And then you have the confidants who are the inner circle. These are often family, but also the handful of people closest to the leader who often really can change your mind, but often don't use their power well for various reasons that I go into in the book. Now, I'm going to take one more leap here that's going to risk spinning the minds of your listeners. That in each of these circles, you could be a conformist, a colluder, or a courageous follower. A conformist says, whichever circle I'm in, look, I've got my life to live. Whatever they tell me to do, I'm going to do it. I don't blame people for that. We all have very busy lives and our own things to, take care of. But it actually then puts us sometimes at the a negative effect of what the government's doing. The colluder follower is one who takes the worst aspects of the leader, and every leader has some aspects that are not great, and amplifies them. I don't like to politicize things, but I will just a good little example here. The followers who are too close to President Biden, out of loyalty, hid the cognitive problems he was having until too late. And that had a deleterious effect on their own goals. So that would be an example of that. And then we have the courageous follower. And the courageous follower may say, look, I voted for you because of the things you promised to do. I know that you're an imperfect person. That's okay. None of us are perfect. But I want to see you focused on the things you said you would do, not on other things. If that leader starts doing other things, particularly things that violate the sensibilities, the values, the culture, then they speak up and they say, again, just like the courageous follower would do to their supervisor, this isn't okay. This is not what we voted for. And unless you listen and are willing to modify what's happening, don't count on my vote the next time. Now, how you do this, of course, depends where you are in these circles. And that's where, the whole book goes into what are your strategies, what are your powers to make a difference potentially.
Yeah. I I think even though the book was about government politics, right? It can easily be translatable to all situations because number one, we're all in situations where there's a sphere of influence that you have and that you don't have. You're always in an outer circle and an inner circle in some way, in at work, with your family relationships. You have more influence around some people than others. And so a lot of the times, people get frustrated or learn helplessness because they're trying to influence something that they're so far away from that they feel defeated. And, often to move back from that level of disempowerment to empowerment, it's to think what is within your sphere of influence? And are you affecting change there? Are you leaning in to that first? And really thinking about, actually, I have a lot of influence with so and so, or this group of people. And I've never talked about these kinds of things with them. I just sort of kept it to myself. The other thing that you mentioned is the commitment to purpose. And I think for some people, it might be easier to focus always on the purpose or the value. And when it feels misaligned, it feels off, or there's a tension that you feel. And then for others, it's more important to keep the relationship or maintain status quo or maintain quote unquote calm and not, rock the boat. And I guess I wonder what your thoughts are on how to kind of navigate or bridge between, let's say, a conformist who really doesn't want to go there, like really doesn't want to rock the boat, really feels very uncomfortable with the conflict stuff, right? And how, if they're feeling like something's amiss or something's off and they no longer like how things are going, how could they move closer into the courageous followership?
Yeah. I think, what I'm hearing from your description here is life is complicated. We're involved in many dances. We have our partners, we have our children, we have our parents, our bigger family, our condo board, our church, our workplace, our political groups, our community activism. And in each of these, we have a certain amount of energy that we can parcel out, including
Mm-hmm.
taking care of ourselves, of course. So there's not an imperative that you be a courageous follower in every single part of your, but
Good
where
point.
but where it's really important to you because you feel that there's something really core at stake for you, for the people you love, for the community you value. That's when it's time to dig a bit deeper and say, where do I get the courage from? Did I have someone in my ancestry who did something that was really courageous and that I've always admired? Can I tap into that kind of energy? Do I have even a fictional figure? Like many people have told me they think about Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird and how he stood up, for what was right in his little southern town there. Or other people have already done something really, really difficult in their lives and found that they survived it. And they go, this is important to me. And I survived that. I can survive this. I may or may not prevail, but I think it's worth me taking the risk and speaking up. Now then the question is how you do it, when you do it, where you do it. Do you need allies to do it? And so there's a lot to this. And again, I covered a lot of this material in the various books. One of the simplest ways for because we're covering so much territory that people can say, yeah, I don't have time to take your graduate degree in followership. How can I start? And I have a very little simple 20 question assessment on that tells people, gives them a reflection on what their followership style likely is in general or at the moment. It's really inexpensive. It's like the price of a hamburger. And and you can take it and it gives you developmental feedback, and then you can take it again up to 4 times a year for no extra money. And I think that's a place to start. And then if you find yourself sufficiently intrigued with this, yeah, I would encourage you to dig into one or another of the books I have or that others have on this subject. There are even books, for example, in the ecumenical world on courageous followership in an ecumenical setting. So it depends when you are led to use your voice to make a difference.
Yeah, yeah. Where can they find that assessment? Is it on your website?
Yeah, it's on my website. And, I think you're showing my name on the
Yep.
screen, and it's irachaleffauthor.com.
Yeah, and we will also share the all of that in the show notes so people can find you.
Good. And it's called the Followership Styles Assessment. And again, it's so simple, 20 minutes. And then hopefully what it's telling you will recognize it, and you will see one or two things you might start doing a little differently to perhaps move the style to somewhere where you'd like it to be. Or it may be telling you, gee, it's right where you want it to be.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, definitely a good way to start is just like to reflect on where am I now and, some self-awareness about am I happy with where I am or what does this mean in terms of my next steps? Yeah. And the other things I heard from you that also I think are good skills is where do you derive your inspiration? Who do you admire, right? And can I visualize that person in certain situations to be inspired in the moment? And I'll add one more, which is something that we didn't say explicitly, but I think we've been talking around, which is courage doesn't just like happen. I mean, for a few lucky people, they're born that way. Okay. But most of us actually have to practice this stuff and it takes time. And this is called the hard skills for a reason. This is one of those hard skills that are worth developing over time. I have built up my courage in all kinds of ways from speaking in public. I was so far away from that early on in my career and upbringing, and I'm in a very different place with that now. But it took lots and lots of practice and lots of discomfort. Same thing with speaking up. I can now speak up in some places with some people and not in other places and other people. It's just an ongoing practice. So, just like any other hard skill.
That's a great point. And, when I do workshops on this, we role play it. And of course, in a role play, it's a bit easier than in real life. But the point is to practice, because practice, you find, where do you stumble? Where do you clutch or, find yourself faltering? And great, do it again, try it a few times. It's like any skill. It does take a bit of practice, and yet it doesn't take as much practice as you might think once you get the hang of it. And then, you know, necessarily with the most high risk situation in your life, start with something small, get a little win and pat yourself on the back. And then,
Yeah.
be ready to try again on something more consequential.
Exactly, exactly. So I promised everyone we would also talk about intelligent disobedience. What is this?
Yeah. So when, when I was teaching courageous followership, which I did in many, many different environments. At one point, one group, I was talking about authority and how most of the time it makes sense to comply with authority, but sometimes it doesn't. The authority doesn't have the right information. Their information's old. They have a blind spot. And if you complied with them, it would actually have a negative effect, which wouldn't be good for anyone. And a woman who was in the class raised her hand and she said, I have an example of this under my desk. And I said, what do you mean? And she had a dog under her desk. And she said, this dog is being trained to be a guide dog for a blind person. And for the first 18 months of its life, it lives with my family and it learns how to obey all the commands that it needs to obey. But then it goes to a higher level trainer who teaches it intelligent disobedience. And I never heard that term before. I said, well, what is
Mhm.
this? And she said, well, think about it. If a person who's blind gives a dog a command to go forward across the street, and the dog sees a quiet hybrid car coming around the corner, it must not obey. If it obeys, it's going to get them hurt or killed. And if it can't differentiate between when to obey and when not to obey, it can't be a guide dog. And I thought, wow, We can teach dogs that? Why aren't we teaching you?
Exactly. Why can't we teach
And
ourselves?
that began my exploration of how do we teach intelligent disobedience to humans. And it's actually, in some ways, it's a disturbing book because it has examples when people fail to use intelligent disobedience, but it's also an easy book because it's got lots of good stories that show how we learn the skill of obeying intelligently, including how do we teach it to our children? And why do we want to teach it to our children? Our children are supposed to obey, obey, obey. Really? Do you want your child to obey if the soccer coach says, "Oh, it doesn't matter that it's lightning, just stay on the field for one more practice"? No, you don't want them to obey. And yet, you've taught them to obey authority. You have to give them the concurrent or concomitant skills on how to disobey it intelligently, respectfully, but firmly when they're in that situation where authority is not telling them something or doing something in their best interest.
Yeah. A lot of what I'm hearing is critical thinking skills, like stopping yourself for a second and asking yourself, does this make sense? Is it okay that we're doing this? Will it harm other people? Do I have a responsibility here? Instead of just sort of going through the motions of, I told you so, yes, sir, I'll jump as high as you want me to, including jumping off a bridge. And so some of that is critical thinking. And then some is trying to find that line of like boundary setting. What is a boundary that is just not acceptable to cross? And can I kind of speak that boundary out loud? Can I say this is not okay or this is hurtful and not everybody has learned how to be critical thinkers and set boundaries when they're worried about something. There are cases, lots of cases where I think probably both you and I are working with our clients to develop that boundary setting skill and know what their boundaries are in the first place. What is an acceptable boundary? And I guess I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how to identify and build those boundaries?
What I found is that it's very shocking for a child, for example, when an authority figure tells it to do something that it was taught is wrong. It also can be shocking in the workplace when you're told to do something
Hmm.
wrong. And we have, very, very high level examples of this, where tremendous fraud with billions of dollars in companies or Volkswagen making changes to their ignition, to their clean emission systems and, falsifying tens of thousands or a major bank opening up literally a million accounts without the client's consent. This is not small potatoes. But why do people follow? Well, one of the reasons is that it's so shocking that the fight, flight, or freeze response kicks in. Now, you can't really fight with your boss usually. There's very few environments that'll tolerate that. You could jump up and run out of the meeting room, but that's not very acceptable either. So what do people do? They freeze. Oh, you want me to do that? Okay. Now instead, and again, in my book, I this is actually a free download for how to work with your children on this. There's a very simple way to get them to overcome with a little bit of practice that freeze that happens so that they can then use the skills you're talking about to question and to speak up and keep themselves safe. And it's not just for children, but I've been particularly interested in, how do we do this with children? Because I think if children learn the difference between appropriate obedience and intelligent disobedience, then as adults in workplaces, they will bring those skill sets there. So again, that's a free download, same website. You just have to, find it on the website. And it's called Intelligent Disobedience for Children. It's a little workbook for parents on how to teach children this.
That's awesome. Amazing. Love that. So let's move into one last question that I have for you, which is, let's say I have leaned into the courage thing and tried to be a courageous follower, tried to bring up concerns, but the behavior is really, really egregious. Abusive, yelling, harmful, all the things, right? At what point, if any, in your opinion, do we stop? Do we give up? Do we leave? What are sort of like the remaining options when it's gotten really bad and we feel like, I don't know what else to try, and this is really harmful to me too?
Right. So again, it's contextual. If you have the financial ability to leave your job and take the time to find a better place, that might be the right move for you. Some people don't feel they have that. So then they have to try to use the organizational mechanisms, if there are any, that would help protect them. If those don't exist, then you're at least try to look for allies. One of the things, for example, when I work with congressional offices, that again, there are several members who are notorious for just being so verbally abusive. And what I would do when I was working in that office, I would get the chief of staff or one of the managers, a legislative director or communications director, to say, when your staff member goes into because they need to speak to the member or the member has called them in, you go with them. And if that member starts to berate and, scream at them, you just say, ma'am, sir, this is really important to you, and I'm going to take care of it. Give me a few minutes. Put your arm around the staff member and get them out of there, because your responsibility is to keep them from being abused like that. They calms down, the member often calms down. You can bring them back together and you can say, now here's our ideas on how to get done what we think you're telling us you want done. So you have to work it within the context of what you're dealing with, the whole situation.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm hearing that if you have allies, if you have people in higher positions of power, one way or another, that it's another way to think about how to not feel you're isolated or alone in this, but really get the support needed, if there are some options.
Yes.
All right. So I honestly could go on, but I won't because we're just about at time. Let's re-review where you can find Ira Chaleff. I'm going to share right now where you can find his stuff right here. Okay. Ira Chaleff. Audience, what did you take away from today? And more importantly, what is one small change you can implement this week based on what you learned from Ira? It could just be taking his assessment, or it could be something else. But share it with us on LinkedIn so we could cheer you on, whatever that is. If you enjoyed this episode, you know my love language is referrals, recommendations, and nice reviews. You can do that on my YouTube channel at Dr. Mira Brancu or any of the podcast platforms that you find the hard skills on. And together, we will navigate the complexities of leadership and emerge stronger on the other side. Thank you so much for joining me and Ira Chaleff today on this journey. This is Mira Brancu signing off. And until next time, stay steady, stay present, and keep building those hard skills muscles that he just described. Thank you.